Welcome to the Veterinary Project Podcast, episode 126.
Welcome to the show created by vets featuring absolutely no pets. This is the Veterinary Project Podcast, hosted by Dr. Michael Bugg and Dr. Jonathan Light. Our resident veterinarians have swapped out their stethoscopes in favor of microphones to bring you the Veterinary Project Podcast, a show focused on real conversations, aimed to connect this amazing profession full of remarkable people. Through the sharing of collective stories and wisdom, and connecting over the many unique challenges we face, we invite you to join our community of veterinary professionals leading intentional lives. And now, here are the hosts of the Veterinary Project Podcast, Dr. Michael Bugg and Dr. Jonathan Light.
Welcome back to the Veterinary Project Podcast. You are joined by Dr. Jonathan Light and Dr. Michael Bugg. As always, Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jonathan. That was a great conversation. I was really looking forward to having Amy on. It was fantastic.
Well, who did we talk with? What was it all about?
It was Amy Oliver. We went into some awesome stuff. And I know we have a good friend that uses, her consulting services and has great things to say. So I'm happy we finally get to release this to the veterinary community.
Absolutely. So Amy Oliver is our guest today, a progressive, forward-minded leader, very influential in the healthcare space, and has imparted her knowledge in the veterinary space here over the last number of years, including with Dr. Steph Van Dynes and Dr. David Snell at their practice. That's where we first heard about Amy. And we actually have our first clinic manager working with her in the Healthy Business series through Mosaic. So excited about it. Before we get into the conversation, which everybody is going to enjoy, Mike, you just came back from Dominican. You were there with your accountability group. Tell us what this means and why you would go across the world to meet with the dudes.
Yeah, it was a great trip. I mean, transformational. I'm trying not to oversell it, but it might be up there with that. The reason for the Dominican, one of the guys just lives down there for a year. His wife is from the Dominican. So they took their family and they're doing a 1-year live down there, maybe longer. So we're like, when are we going to have a chance to go check it out, with someone that lives there as our sort of tour guide? But the intention of the trip, and it's funny, we get into the conversation with Amy, and there's a piece in there where we're talking about clinic owners getting feedback and how do you get feedback so that you can continue to grow. And I recently heard kind of a saying that when someone says something maybe that's a little bit critical, your first response should be thank you, right? Because if you get all up in arms, people are going to stop giving you feedback, and then you're going to lose that sort of evolution and that growth. The entire point of our trip to the Dominican was we do this thing where we call it one sheet. So it's basically like, this is our life on one sheet, right? Here's what I got going on: financial, business, relationships, kids, family, everything. And you present it to the group. Now there's only 6 of us. So when I say group, there's a group of 6 of us. We've been doing this for years and years and years. We are exceptionally close. Everything is discussed in a very loving and supportive way, but they will also call out your bullshit immediately. And it is the coolest environment in the world to be in. And that's all we do. We booked an Airbnb and we just mastermind on this. And the whole thing was get through these one sheets. We were going to do a few other things, but we went so deep on them that's all we got accomplished, right? And by the time you do someone's, it takes hours to properly get through one of them. So then
something that you prepped ahead and then brought.
Oh yeah, it was mandatory. Don't show up here without what's funny though, what's really interesting is you prepare them with a lot of intention, but the conversation sometimes doesn't go where you expect. People pick up and they're like, well, you kind of left that out and here, and then it opened something you didn't think of or a new perspective. But it was amazing.
So you come back from that very briefly because we need to get into our conversation. What do you do with it now so that it doesn't just sit there?
Well, long flights for me to get home. So I journaled. I have many pages of debriefing that I'm going to go through. I literally got back at 2 a.m. last night, and now we're recording this. So I haven't fully digested yet, but we are going to follow up here in a week with another debriefing call. And then this is the group I meet with every Monday. So, it's not just done. We will debrief it And we all had action items, of like, okay, what's the right next thing for you? You need to start implementing that like right now. And I know when I jump on with them next Monday, I know there's going to be questions. Have you done those easy things we said? And then let's keep working on the bigger things as well. So it was amazing. I honestly wish everyone listening to this could find a group and have a group like this. It is life-changing.
I'm excited for you. I can see it for anybody who's not watching him. You can see the smile on his face, wrinkles in his eyes of happiness, not, a little bit of tiredness, but hey, that's part and parcel.
I caught a lot of sun coming from -30 to +30 Celsius. It's a big swing in temperature.
Back to -30 again. Well, let's get into this. We are in for discussion. Mike, thanks for sharing with us, being so open. Look forward to seeing what action items and the continual evolution that is Dr. Mike LeBog on this podcast, with everybody being a part of it too. So moving on to Amy Oliver, a short bio for everyone that's listening. Amy is an experienced healthcare executive and the founder and CEO of Amy Oliver & Co., where she offers trusted advisory services and professional leadership and business coaching to practice owners, leaders, academics, and organizations in health and social sectors. Amy has coached and advised hundreds of healthcare leaders and practice owners. She is passionate about bridging the gaps around strategy, management, and leadership through knowledge translation at the crossroads of health and business. She's the founder of Healthy Business Series, the Womentum series, and the online leadership platform, The Stack. She holds an MBA with a dual concentration in organizational leadership and health administration. She's a pharmacist, a certified leadership coach, and globally certified project management professional. Amy holds certificates in emotional intelligence and advanced strategic management and leadership. She's a sought-after keynote speaker and a member of the Speakers Bureau of Canada. Amy has won multiple health sector and leadership awards and is a recent alumni of the prestigious Governor General Canadian Leadership Conference. Without a doubt, you are going to gain knowledge and some learning from this conversation. Please enjoy Amy Oliver. Amy, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I feel like this show is going to be over like that for the amount of information and the back and forth. And really, even in the pre-recording, we wanted to get going. I said, no, let's wait till the recording to get started. So thank you very much for joining Mike and I this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so excited. It's really exciting to be here.
Amy, for those that don't know you, your company, or the plethora of different hats that you wear right now, share with us a little bit about yourself and what's brought you to this part in your professional career.
Awesome. Well, I can start by talking about a little bit what we do right now and really what my goals are in this profession, which is really, I'm super, super passionate about making sure that all different healthcare professionals who work in community-based practices can live and lead really successful personal and professional lives. And that looks different for everybody, right? Success is different for a lot of people. Some people it's running multiple big practices. Some people it's finding that nice balance of work-life harmony. Some people it's, just practicing in a really particular way that really lights them up inside. And so all of the things that I could tell you that we do really have that main goal in mind. But at its core, we really work on translating business and leadership skills into healthcare practices because so many healthcare providers, vets, we also work with pharmacies and physicians and physios and optometry. Any of the healthcare professions, they go to school forever to become real masters of their clinical craft, right? And then they go out into the real world and they own businesses and they manage practices and they sit on boards and they, are members of their chamber of commerce and they're out there doing all of these other things. And you didn't learn that in school, right? So that's sort of where we come in. We're really passionate about making sure that people can live their professional and personal lives in the ways that they want to and break a lot of those stereotypes that we've seen around what practice should look like.
Excellent. Well, what I want to do with that conversation then is to go backwards in order to go forwards. When we're speaking about we and Amy Oliver & Co., which is your professional brand and your business name, let's go backwards. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what's got you to the point where you feel, and you do, because I know that for a fact through our mutual friends, have this ability to speak so well and lead in this healthcare area.
Yeah. So way back to the beginning. Well, I always knew I wanted to work in community in some way, right? I really loved the idea of working with people, touching a lot of different parts of community. And So I went into pharmacy, was sort of the first route. Straight out of high school, I got a job actually at random at the small community pharmacy down the street from my house. And, within a few months, just loved that and decided that's what I was going to do. So, went through the process, got into pharmacy school, graduated pharmacy school and started to practice. And actually, patient care practice was not my favorite. And I'll be really honest. And I think that's important to say too, because a lot of people go to school in all of these clinical programs with the intention of being a clinician, right? Or a care provider. And then sometimes it's hard to say that doesn't light you up anymore. So for me, it was pretty obvious early on that part wasn't my favorite. My favorite was the way it all worked, the way that different businesses and practices work together, the way that we could improve people's lives, but also the people inside of the businesses and the practices. So really quickly, I decided I wanted to be a pharmacy owner. So I did that about 6 months out of school. I became a franchise owner of a Shoppers Drug Mart in a pretty busy mall pharmacy. And so I did that.
For those that don't know what a Shoppers Drug Mart is, because that's pretty Canadian.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Yeah. Okay. So you probably have some American listeners too, right? So it would look much like a CVS or a Walgreens, but it's an independently owned franchise kind of model. And I would say the organizational culture and reputation are a bit different than perhaps CVS and Walgreens, but at its surface, it looks much like that. So big box store, big cosmetic section, also a pharmacy inside of a mall. So I did that for about 3 years and it was really exciting. I mean, it was in my early 20s. I walked into this multi-million-dollar business, had to figure out how to navigate a team of 55 people, learn a lot about business, communicate with a lot of people inside of the mall where our space was, a lot of the contractors, people coming in to fix light bulbs and fix tiles, all of these things that were not taught to you in pharmacy school. So that was a really intensive learning experience. But one of the things that I liked the best during my time as an owner was bringing on students, training new owners, developing my team. And I really learned that that's really where my passion lies. It wasn't so much in the actual pharmacy practice. It was in working with people to be able to work in the best way possible and develop systems that allow everybody to be successful. And when you're doing that in any type of health practice, it has ripple effects across the community, right? Where the people that you're serving then are served in a better way and they're able to have all kinds of great outputs or outcomes for the people that they serve. So I did that for a few years and then I transitioned into a corporate role where I supported pharmacies across Manitoba and also Saskatchewan at times. So at my busiest point in that role, I had about 73 pharmacies that I oversaw operations for. And I loved that job because it was really just, again, supporting all these franchise owners who didn't know a lot about how to run the business of pharmacy. Got to do really fun things in philanthropy, social investment, regulatory affairs, advocacy, got to touch a lot of those different pieces. But then that came to an end too, right? I'm someone who gets bored after a few years, as you probably can tell already. So when I left that and started this company, we're almost 5 years in now. At that time, it was still just pharmacy, but be able to support independent pharmacy owners by providing them the type of support in business and leadership you would get in a corporate environment, but while still having the autonomy of an independent practice. And so that's where it started for the first year or so. And after that, it sort of exploded to where we are now, which is supporting practice owners in all different types of community-based healthcare professions and right across Canada. And so it's been a really exciting ride.
What would be examples of healthcare sectors that you work with now? And then we'll jump into the vet space specifically.
Yeah. So most of my practice, we dabble in a lot of the smaller ones, but most of our practice is in pharmacy, veterinary, and with physicians. And the physicians sort of spread around between family medicine and also specialties like hematology, oncology, even some healthcare academia as well.
That's interesting. Excellent. So would you say that you are a business owner by mistake, or this was the plan and the evolution of skill, which led you then to where Amy Oliver & Co. is today?
Yeah, it was certainly a long process and a long journey, a lot of careful planning. But what I will say is that I'm an entrepreneur because I'm unapologetically living the type of life that I want to live, which includes getting the outcomes that I want by supporting other people, but also building it around the life that I want to live, right? And I think so often in healthcare, I mean, you can see just from post-COVID healthcare systems are dumpster fires right now, for lack of a better word. And a lot of it is because for so long, healthcare providers have been doing work that is meaningful to their communities, but in a very selfless way. And it's come at the expense of their lives. Right? We're seeing record levels of burnout, mental health issues in healthcare providers. And so I'm not willing to work in that way. So I still work a lot, but on my own terms and in a way that really benefits a lot of people, but can still, have a great life with lots of kids and lots of travel and all the wonderful things. And I think that we can get to a place with a lot of these practices and people that touch our ecosystem and allow them to live that way too. So building the business, back to your question around, am I an entrepreneur maybe by accident? I would say no, it was carefully crafted, but with not necessarily with the goal of owning a business, rather with the goal of accomplishing what I want to professionally, which is supporting a lot of people and then living my life the way that I want to live it at the same time.
Excellent. Mike, anything to add to that before we jump down one of the
I
two
love
of those
that
lanes?
topic, like helping people unapologetically live their life. That just lights me up. So I have so many questions there. I guess I'll jump in at when you first acknowledged that the patient care practice wasn't for you. I was smiling because it also wasn't for me. And I felt really bad admitting it. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, I don't know what feelings they all were, but like some shame, some guilt. I'm leaving everyone else out to dry because they're already swamped. And I'm like, I'm going to sit this one out. But to get to where, what you wanted, what I'm seeing here is you kept letting things go. You're like, okay, there's these things, this has to go. Now I own a business, but I really like developing people. So I'm going to let, now I don't sell, there's no more cosmetic and dairy division in Shoppers Drug Mart. I'm building teams. And you just kept chopping and focusing. How do people do that? Because when you chop something, whatever feeling you're feeling, use me as an example, feeling shame. How do you get over that?
Yeah. Wow. That's a loaded question. But I do think you're bang on. And I think, you start to let things go in terms of the different tasks that you do or the sections of your portfolio that you're doing for sure is a good start. But it's even just recognizing that if you spend more of your time on the things that you're good at and the things that you love, you will be more productive, right? So we tend to say, okay, if we can get through all of these different things on our to-do list or add 3 or 4 or 5 more things to our to-do list, then we'll get one step ahead. But much like you said, I think the reality is you will get further ahead the more things you take off your to-do list. And that can look different ways. So part of it can be just ditching it, like actually saying, I'm going to let this go. This is no longer part of me or part of my problem. But part of it is also delegating it, right? So we don't have to do everything ourselves. We can surround ourselves with people that have skills and interests that are different than ours and focus our time in the places that we can have the most benefit and the most joy. And I think that takes, some awareness as well. But it's easy when we think about it in other parts of our life, right? I think probably a lot of people that are listening have house cleaners that come into their house and they go, okay, well, this is a task that has to be done. It's important in my life. I don't enjoy doing it. So I'm going to choose to delegate this to someone else. And I think that we can make those decisions in our professional lives too, right? We can do it in our practices, we can do it in our businesses, and we can do it in our personal lives. And when you spend all of your time doing things that actually bring you joy and light you up, you get really good at them. And when you get really good at them, you can be more effective, you can build systems, and you can really catapult quite a bit further into the future.
Yeah. Sorry, John, I'm jumping in again. I totally agree. One thing I see is I have tons of conversations and the word busy is always coming up, and it's almost like a badge of honor. I'm just so busy. I'm so busy. And that's counter to what you're saying, but it's so addicting.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, right? We say that because of social norms and really crappy, pardon my language, but crappy stereotypes that we've been socialized with, right? So I think in its most realistic term, I'm still very busy, but I get to spend all of my time in work that I'm really engaged in. And I think that's possible for other people too. So we can all remember days where you go to work, for 8 or 10 hours and it feels like the day is dragging on forever and you just hate it. And then there are other days where the time just flies by and you're loving every moment of it. And so it's really all about how do we get more days that feel like that, right? How do we build that for people? How do we get them to that place where they're not dreading it? They're not exhausted at the end of a 10-hour day, and they're able to balance it or create that type of harmony with the other things in their life that bring them joy. We so often see people in healthcare practices, and I see this all the time in the vet world now too, is we feel like our identity is being a veterinarian or a pharmacist or a physician. And all of the things in our lives are there to support this identity of being a vet or a practice owner. and all the people around us are supporting our ability to go to work, the place where we bought our house or the transportation, like all of these things are there holding up this identity of being a vet or pharmacist or physician, instead of saying, how do we allow our job or occupation as a veterinarian, physician, pharmacist to support the life that we want? We've been looking at it backwards this whole time, and I wholeheartedly believe you can have both at the same time.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's jump into the veterinary industry, working now with, and I love this, and I don't know, Mike, if we've had another guest that's actually worked in multiple healthcare segments at one time. So I'm very interested to hear, starting off, Amy, similarities in some of the challenges that exist right now, or is it just that veterinarians are as special as they all think they are, myself included? We think that, this is only in veterinary medicine.
There are tons and tons of similarities, for sure. Yep. The other thing that I think is so interesting about working cross-sectorally like this is that there are so many opportunities to transfer knowledge and best practices from one space to another. So, for example, in the veterinary world, I found it quite enjoyable to go into a lot of practices and see how they're all running their vet pharmacies, because coming from a really intensive pharmacy world and then walking into these, generally like smaller, in my context, smaller dispensaries or pharmacies inside of these vet practices and seeing how they run, seeing all the opportunities you can pull from human pharmacies into vet pharmacies is spectacular. But at the same time, there's even heavier and more serious opportunities. I just had a conversation a few weeks ago about medically assisted dying, right, in the human healthcare world, and all of the opportunities that exist for us in that space to learn more, to figure out not just how do we serve patients, but also how do we help providers understand this? How do you help them deal with moral distress that might be related to this? And one of the questions I asked to this group of human healthcare providers was, who's talking to the vets? We so often have seen, this is a huge part of what you do all the time. And you have all kinds of experience with this. And we weren't even considering having conversations to get some of the best practices around how do you deal with this. And even trauma, I would go as far as saying in a lot of veterinary practices, you see a lot of trauma. In some human healthcare practices, for sure you do. But in many others, you don't see trauma until, all of a sudden we're dealing with a global pandemic. And now we're going, how do we deal with trauma in practices? How do we support our providers properly? And so there's so many heavy and also smaller operational opportunities for us to look across sectors and stop reinventing the wheel to try to figure out how to do things properly when amazing best practices exist literally right down the road.
Well, let's talk about a couple of those heavy situations that are in veterinary medicine. Then we can talk about best practices. Are there current or certain themes that you've seen coming in from the outside that are more apparent than others right now?
I would say we're seeing burnout across all practices, right? So at its core, burnout is when people are not just emotionally exhausted, but they also start to become a bit cynical. So essentially, people know things are rough. That happens a lot of the time. But when you no longer see a light at the end of the tunnel and you don't feel like it's going to get better, you just assume this is the way it is now. That's when you start seeing burnout in practices. And I think we're at that point now for a lot of vet practices. And the reason that I think I'm seeing that still has a lot to do with the pandemic. In human healthcare, we saw, the pandemic happened. It was complete chaos, exhausting, very difficult for all the providers. But we're starting to come out the other end of that, right? We're not over COVID yet, but we're slowly making our way out the other side. And the human healthcare providers can start taking a little bit of a sigh of relief and going, okay, we're slowly going back to the way, I'm using quotation marks for those with audio, but like the way we used to be, right? But in a lot of the vet practices, you had these huge COVID puppy booms and things like that happening. And all of these new, pets are going to require care ongoing. It doesn't go back to the way it was for you anymore. And so it's really difficult, I think, because I'm seeing practices that are unable to recruit. So they're having issues with actually too much demand, right? And having a hard time actually serving all of the patients, particularly those in rural communities. They're not getting a chance to rest and relax and take breaks. They can't take vacation. They would have to close their practice. And it's causing a lot of issues. So I'm seeing exhaustion, I'm seeing burnout, I'm seeing trauma, and I'm seeing a lot of people that are starting to feel a bit cynical about it. And they want to go back to feeling a lot of joy in their work. But it's hard to swim towards the island when all you're doing is treading water and trying not to drown, right? That's where they're at. They're just constantly treading water, trying to make it to the end of the day. And then they start over the next day in the deep end, treading water again. And so how do we actually pull them out of that and get them on their way somewhere?
Exactly. That is my daily battle and my daily goal as CEO of Mosaic and Rural Mixed Animal is dealing with exactly that situation. Is how do we get everybody actually treading water the same direction and then moving towards that island that may or may not be there in some cases, especially when we're talking veterinary professional shortages. And that's a tough one. It's a very tough one with no clean answers either. It's not like, hey, you go spend $1 million, you'll have it. No, we've seen that from the big guys. It's not working.
There are a lot of easy answers, though, that help. They're not this, full solution all on their own. But again, in the same way that we've seen a lot of, practice owners have never had business training necessarily. A lot of the time, they haven't had operational training either. They don't know, how do you even go about becoming more efficient in your systems? How do you put lean management strategies into your practice? And like with that example, people hear lean management, they think, oh, we're going to go cut a bunch of labor. But that's not actually the case. It's how do we make sure that all the moments that your people are working, your teams are working, are adding value to whatever services you're providing, right? How do we make sure that we put those systems in place? Sometimes it needs an external eye. Sometimes it just needs an understanding of how do you even evaluate your own practice, right? How do you find those opportunities? And if you can get your practices working in an optimal fashion, sometimes you don't even need to recruit new people, right? Sometimes you can just get to a place where it works better. So yeah, I think there's lots of opportunities, both operationally from a management perspective, to do things better that will support better mental health in our practices. But then there's also just actually providing proper mental health support in our practices and creating psychologically safe environments. Right.
So let's talk about that for a second. What does that mean within the context of veterinary medicine or any healthcare professions? Because it's a hot topic, but I also think that from what I see online, the training that I've learned, it's all over the place right now in terms of actual core details to psychological safety in the workplace.
Yeah, it's something we're seeing a lot of people talk about, but less people walking the walk, right? So what are the things that we actually do? So we want to look at, what is your culture actually, not what do you say it is and what do you want it to be, right? What is the culture you're actually living and breathing? What would people say that it feels like to work there? What does it feel like to go home at the end of the day? So those are, what your culture actually is. There are a lot of things in organizational cultures that you can see and that we say and that we talk about. But when I have this in a presentation, I like using the classic iceberg slide, which basically means, there's the small part that's visible and observable on the surface of the water, but there's this huge piece underneath the water that we can't see. And those are the parts that we need to focus on, right? Because that's what's going to sink your ship, like quite literally.
Sorry, quick question on that. How do you get, as a third party, you have probably an easier time, but how do you get honest feedback from people that are dependent on a paycheck of the person they're giving the feedback to?
Yeah. Well, and so this is another big issue, right? Is how do you even know what your culture is? How do you know what's going on and how do you make it better? And I think the biggest issue or the biggest problem that I see owners and leaders doing is they try to solve the problems themselves instead of engaging their teams in problem solving. So the reality is if you're going to come up with your own ideas and you're going to take a full top-down traditional approach to solving management and people issues, it's not going to work. And the reason for that is you can only see the world from where you stand, right? And if you're coming up with great ideas, they're great ideas that would work well for you if you were in those people's positions. They're not necessarily the ideas that will actually work for the people in those positions. So when we start helping people become more collaborative and collectivistic leaders. I like to use the word collectivistic leadership. When we're able to help them figure out the systems to actually engage everybody in the discussions, be very intentional about gaining perspective from the people in their workplace, then we're able to do that in a better way. And so some concrete examples, some concrete strategies of how people can actually do this would be things like, if anybody has any ideas or feedback, come and let me know. That's not a psychologically safe presentation to your team because people will still feel like the perception on their end is that I am complaining if I come forward and tell you things, right? Whereas if you say, I want everyone to come and play devil's advocate, and by the end of the week, try to give me one thing that could go wrong here, right? So you're actually inviting them to submit criticism, ideas, issues, observations to you on purpose, instead of them feeling like they're complaining or raising issues. So there are ways that you can even just change the way you ask questions, right? You don't need extra hours in the day or the week. It's how do you frame situations to get people to actually contribute in a meaningful way to the goals that you have.
Let's role play. Let's do it. We're doing this on the spot because I'm an employer, 100 plus employees. There's many others that have smaller teams, bigger teams. And I'm going, that sounds amazing, Amy. What are you talking about? Let's do this. Because I was just working on some mission and vision goals setting this morning. And I asked for feedback in that video, which is exactly what you said not to do. So how would I turn that switch? What would that actual direct message look like to make it psychologically safe for that person to give feedback back?
Okay, so I want to make sure I have this scenario correct. So you presented a potential mission and vision to your team and then asked for feedback. Is that correct?
That's correct. So we've already gone through employer value proposition. We are in the rollout segment now. We've already imparted it and gained a lot of feedback in the development of it, but we know it's never done. It is never done because if it's done, then it might as well just get tossed in the garbage. I'd love to see what this looks like because there's many that need this help.
Yeah. So, I mean, it could be as simple as saying, I want you to think about, or as a team, let's think about or brainstorm 20 ways that we're not living these values or missions or vision right now. And by the end of the month, let's see if as a team, we could come up with 20 opportunities to do this better. Right. And so do you see kind of how like the feeling is a little bit different? Like they're going like, okay, now to be part of this goal is to actually poke holes in your idea. I'm being invited to be a devil's advocate. I want to. And so you can make it fun. I've seen people that do it in a structured way where they say like, write on this form or send me an email and give me your idea. I've seen other people that have made it really fun, like in their staff room had almost like a board game wall where they had to move across to get to the finish line. I've had people who had competitions, you come up with more ideas or more criticisms, you get star charts. The funniest part about the star chart was I asked what happened to the person who had the most stars. And the answer was nothing. There was not like no gift card. There's no pizza party, no half day off work. It was just the satisfaction of knowing they had the most stars. So it's literally a dollar store solution, right? And we're often thinking like they need to be really big, elaborate things. But I think it's just literally how you ask the question. If the perception of the question is that they don't really want the feedback they're asking me because they're supposed to ask me, they will not give you the feedback. If the perception is, oh, this is fun, let me see how I can contribute, that feels safer. Does that make sense?
Love it. Sure does. And I like all the different ideas that you provided for because, challenges and games make the day go by a lot more. Excellent. Burnout solutions, looking at operational plus bigger picture pieces. Where have you seen the most benefit specific in veterinary medicine working with teams over the last 3 years? Where have you seen, hey, I'm able to impact this team, the clients they serve, the animals, et cetera? Where have you had the most benefit, do you think?
Mm-hmm. So I'll give you maybe 3 examples that were all different provinces, different types of practices. So we had one team that we worked with where they really felt like their primary priority was taking care of their employees. Okay, so this is a rural practice. They're the only ones in town, overflowing with demand, and the team is burning out. And so we spent a lot of time in that practice working specifically on employee engagement and with the team, right in there, deep and dirty, boots in the mud with the team on how do you become more engaged in the work. Some of it was training. Some of it was, I have a psychotherapist, a physician psychotherapist on my team as well, who went in and did a lot of practical strategies for workplace mental health in clinical practices. How do you help overwhelmingly busy people actually do some of these things? So we did that, I think was really important in that practice because we could go in and talk about operational improvements. We could go in and talk about strategy. We could talk about metrics. We could talk about all those things. None of it would matter until we nailed changing the way that the people are feeling at work. Okay. So finding out what the first and core problems are, I think, in each practice and figuring out what you need to deal with first. So with that practice, it was that. In another practice, they had a really great culture, great environment. They were feeling really good. They're just ready to take things to the next level. So in those cases, it's operational efficiency, right? How do we go in, look at the systems, look at the processes, figure out where there's opportunities to improve in those spaces so we can reinvest the extra time and also money into growing and expanding and doing a lot of exciting things, right? And in that case, they wanted to go and expand into multi-clinic ownership, looking at how do you create the space and the time, even in the owner's portfolio, right? So that they can go invest in potentially growing their business in other ways. And then in another one, we spent a lot of time on recruitment, right? So what's interesting in the vet industry is I haven't worked with very many vet clients who need to grow their client portfolios. They're usually pretty good at filling up. So in other healthcare industries, like pharmacies, they're much more competitive. Physiotherapy clinics, they're always like, how do we fill up our appointments? How do we fill up our schedules? And so we talk strategy from a client perspective. But what's been really fun in the vet world is you can turn the whole strategy conversation on its head and say, why should people work here? Right. And that's a really hard question. So it's not why should people choose you as their vet? It's why should people choose you as their employer? And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what makes you special enough to stand out from all of the other postings that are out there. And how do we start changing the way that you're seen in the community, in the veterinary community, as a key employer? And not even just the veterinary community, but also the support staff and the admin and reception in this community in which you live. Like, why should people come work here instead of the insurance outlet down the street or the restaurant or, these other places?
For that particular clinic, what was the time frame around deliverables, setting objectives, the objections that came up from whether it was the ownership, leadership, or the team members themselves, which are part of either that solution or that problem?
Yes. So I wouldn't say I've had many objections from owners, but they sometimes will have a hard time getting their staff on board for sure, right? Change is not easy for anyone. It happens all the time. It's very necessary, but it's not easy for people. And at its core, people always worry about what does it mean for me if things are changing here, right? If you tackle that right off the hop, it's better, right? You make sure that you tell people how it's going to impact them right from the beginning. But in terms of timelines, every project is different. Every client is different. I would say almost all of the vets that I've worked with, it involves, we decide to work together. It takes usually a couple of months before I can find time in my schedule to fly there and go inside of their practice and spend a few days with them, evaluating what's going on. And then we put together a list of recommendations and a lot of best practices. So we provide them with a lot of material around best practices and how they actually apply to their own practice. And then it's a matter of implementation. And that part is very dependent on their own schedules, availabilities, and lives. So in some practices where the owner maybe doesn't practice veterinary medicine anymore, things go quite a bit faster because they have a dedicated resource to doing a lot of the things that we talk about together. And in other practices, they're the primary veterinarian plus have young kids, plus, this, plus that, plus they're building a house. And so it goes a little bit slower. So I don't think there's a perfect answer to that, but I would say you start seeing results right away with some of the low-hanging fruit. And then it depends on the amount of time that you're dedicating to implementing a lot of the things that we talk about.
How involved are you in that implementation phase as opposed to training that leader, that resource to take it that step?
Yeah. So that depends on the agreement that I have with each client. A lot of clients, I think, would ideally like us to be very involved in implementation, but at the end of the day, we still run a business too, right? So it comes down to what did the agreement look like? When we work with people, we look at the problems that they have, the potential solutions we can offer, and the different ways that we could do that might meet their requirements from a timing perspective, a resourcing perspective, and also a financial perspective. Not everybody has tens of thousands of dollars to invest in consulting projects, right? So implementation and support is more expensive, but we do it for many of our clients. And then they basically would meet with me every couple of weeks and we would go over all of the action items, the milestones, what do you need to do next? And it turns very much into a business coaching relationship where we start to figure out how do we get you through each of these and how do we measure their success over time. But other people, sometimes we're in and out, give them the recommendations. And that's sort of what fell into the agreement that we had based on their financial constraints. And then it's up to them to go implement.
Make it work. Excellent. Mike, anything follow up on that part?
Not on that part. I have a whole other tangent, but I don't know where you're taking us.
Let's take it to the tangent before I go back to the personal section of Amy Oliver's life.
Okay. Well, the one I'm just watching the clock and I was like, there was one area I really wanted to get your advice on. I saw it in the pre-notes around men being better allies. And specifically, now I'm being a little bit selfish here because we're in it. Before we hit record, just for the listeners, me and my wife, we have a 4-month, we have a 3.5-month-old. And if I'm being totally honest, if I think back to when I'm practicing and I'm 26 or 27 or 28, I don't have kids. I just had no clue. Like I had no clue what it was like to have kids at home or what that like woman would be experiencing. Like it was just totally foreign to me, right? If I'm being completely honest, I would think of like scheduling. Let's take like the kids are off for February break. And I would get annoyed if it's like, well, they need it because their kids are off. And I would be sitting here as just a single guy with no kids. I just didn't get it. And I think now if I was in practice and I had to be scrubbed in for surgery at 8:30 a.m., I don't know how we would do it. Because like on any given day, our 3-year-old can just throw an atomic bomb into the morning. And it's like, well, 8:30 is not happening. So that's sort of setting the table. I'm so curious on what you have for insights on that, around men being better allies, and then specifically women with children and families, because I honestly don't know how you do it. Like, I'm just like amazed at what they accomplish.
Yeah. I mean, there is so much loaded in there. So, okay, let me start with this. I think the first and most important thing that we can say is that for women and all parents, we should never expect them to actually do it all. And I think that we still have these expectations, based on social norms and generations of primarily women taking care of their families. They're often weren't working and they were in charge of all of the domestic responsibilities, the childcare, but also that I think elder care is maybe a bit extreme, but like I'm 38 and I feel like I have to help my parents with things all of the time, right? They're navigating how to start ordering groceries online, or can I go with them to go for this particular meeting because they maybe don't feel like they're really comfortable doing it on their own. So those responsibilities often fall on women. So for sure, childcare seems front and center, but there are also a lot of other responsibilities that fall onto women primarily. There's a few things, both in our work and in our scheduling, kind of bringing up the examples that you gave. I think we do need to consider everybody as whole people, right? It's hard because we say, well, I'm here to run a business, right? I can't treat some people differently. How is it fair if I give this person special scheduling considerations because they have kids, but then this other person who doesn't have kids is penalized and I'm making them work, the crappier shifts or more weekends or whatever it might be, right? So you can get a lot of heavy feelings on both sides. I think at the end of the day, it's not just about how do we support the people that have kids, it's how do we support everybody in the lives that they have choose to lead, whether they chose to have kids, whether they chose to be equestrians on the side or yoga enthusiasts or whatever it might be. It's the things that they've chosen that are important in their lives. How do we support them in those ways, in the best way possible? And I think for the women or the mothers or the aspiring mothers that are listening to this, I think that it's really important to know that you don't have to choose between being a successful professional and having that identity and being a good mom. And I think that really society for a long time has told us the opposite. If you work, you're labeled a crappy mom. If you don't work, you're labeled, a crappy worker, or you're not contributing to society or whatever it might be. And so it feels like a lose-lose for a lot of women. And the way that we fix that is there are 3 big things. One is at the individual level, which is really helping them figure out how to navigate it, right? Working with them one-on-one. The second is at the organizational level, which is inside of the practices, inside of the professions. How do we start putting some systems in place that help support women differently? And then there's the societal piece. And a big part of that, that sounds like a big, heavy load, right? How do we change society? Like, we're not going to cover that in a whole podcast. But what I can say is, are you in your practice and in your organization, in your profession, influenced by all of the social norms? Or are you actively influencing what those social norms look like? And that means, are you putting women front and center? If you want to talk about being a good ally, it means if you have the chance to host a podcast, are you bringing women onto your podcast? Are you allowing them to be represented fairly, right? Are you asking hard questions like this? We have the ability to ask really hard questions to a lot of people, right? Even if we don't feel like we can control the outcome, you're getting the important people to think about these questions. Right. Another one at a professional level. I don't know about all of the vet colleges, but for a long time in the pharmacy world, you had to practice a minimum of 200 hours per year to keep your license. And it took a lot of advocacy to change that to 600 hours every 3 years. So it still averages 200 hours a year. But if you were on mat leave, you had a hard time keeping your license. right? So there are a lot of opportunities for us to look at the systems and the barriers that are holding women back from doing really well. There are a lot of issues with ownership. So for example, in most healthcare professions, the labor force, the healthcare workforce is primarily women. About 80% in Canada is women, but the ownership of private practices is about 30% women. So there's a really huge discrepancy between that, right? But you look at all of the issues, it's harder to get financing as a woman. It's harder, I've literally had people tell me they've gone to the bank for financing and people have asked if their husband was there to co-sign, and their husband stayed home with the kids and didn't work, and they were working professional women. So we're still dealing with constant stereotypes, constant issues with representation. So get the women out there, have them on your podcast, do a lot of the things that make them feel seen and heard, because other women are listening and watching. And when they realize that other women can do this, this is actually possible, they will start to believe these things are possible for them too, right? So we were talking before about, I have lots of kids and do hard things, right? But I get this impression, it's funny because every time I tell people that I did my MBA with 2-year-old twins at home and pregnant with my third kid while working a busy corporate job, I get a real like, whoa, you're a superwoman kind of reaction from people. And my dream is that that's not notable anymore in the future, right? That's just like normal. That is almost not something that people care to comment on anymore, but it's going to take a long time to get there. And I think that the more we talk about it, the more that we share that these things are possible, the more women that will go, okay, I don't need to choose between being a mom or being an owner. And that's what they're doing, right? I was talking to a pharmacy class not that long ago in the university, and I asked the room, how many of you want to be pharmacy owners? Nobody, not a single one put up their hand, which was shocking in and of itself. But I had some women, students come up to me afterwards. And when I asked them, how come you don't want to think about ownership? Their answer was, well, I want to get out of university. I want to get married. I want to have a family. And they said it in a way as if that was a choice they had to make. There was road A of getting married and having a family, or road B of being a practice owner, and nothing in between. The option of doing both didn't even exist in their periphery. And that's an issue.
Especially when, in my view, the future of veterinary professionals is women, not us men.
I think everybody has a part in it. But This is another really important thing too, is we spend a lot of time looking at the ways that we can fix things for women by creating separate worlds for women. Yeah. So you'll see, and what happens though is that we're not talking about how to make the current world better. Take the example of like a women's gym, right? We'll see gyms that are only for women. And the reason they exist is because it feels like a safer space for women to go to the gym. But why aren't we talking about why the other gyms don't feel like a safe space for women, and then going and fixing those issues?
I think that's in the media right now. I think that might be happening right now as we speak. Yeah. It's an interesting conversation as well, too, of which I blatantly didn't even know existed before.
Yeah. But this is the reality, right? So we need to educate people, and we need to look for ways for them to be good allies. But for you guys, for men and people who are influential men, I think the big part is, how do you make sure that you are raising opportunities for voices of women to be heard, and their representation in and of itself is going to help other women realize those things are possible for them.
And still have men as part of that conversation, which again is, a discussion into itself as.
And I'll add one more thing, because I think it's also really important. And that's that if you say you are going to be an ally of women, or you're a practice owner and you want to support the working moms you have in your practice, spend just as much time encouraging the men in your practice with kids to be more supportive in their domestic households. So if you look at the statistics, for example, a lot of companies in Canada have parental leave benefits, right? Top-ups, things like that are available to both men and women. But men don't use them. They don't use the flexible work policies as much. They don't use the benefits that were created for parents. So encouraging the men in your practice to go home and watch the soccer game, to go to the Christmas concert, to help, carry their load of domestic responsibilities, because we cannot get to a place where women are more active in the workforce unless we get to a place where men are more active at home. So we need to also change what it means to be a man.
I think we leave it at that. I think it's a great spot. That equals part 2 right there in itself. So we are over time, as we knew we would be. And I think we got to about an eighth of what I wanted to talk about. Fantastic. Amy, we need to move into the next part of our conversation here, which is a quick round. Thank you very much for a lot of insights here. We'll follow up in the closing, but first we need to ask some fun questions. And so that first question in our quick round, impact round is, and I have no idea where this is going, is are you a cat or a dog person?
Well, I'm definitely a cat person and irrationally afraid of dogs. I know.
Is there a story behind that? Did you get bitten as a kid or something? And again, you don't have to answer that.
No, but I will say working with all of these vets is proving to be excellent exposure therapy. So I'm slowly getting over my fear of dogs.
Perfect. We can talk again. Definitely. All right. True or false? I knew I wanted to be a pharmacist since I was a kid.
False. I knew I wanted to be an active community servant in some respect, but I knew it would be sciencey, businessy, and that was the good hybrid of both of those things.
Grab. What is your favorite hobby?
Travel.
How would your friends describe what you do for a living?
Ooh, I feel like I should ask them and see if they can figure it out. But I would say they would describe it as just, again, unapologetically helping people live their best lives.
What in this world are you most grateful for?
Opportunity, allies, and honestly, a lot of the things that I have, I worked hard for, but I recognize a lot of the privilege that I have in my life as well. And so I'm grateful for that, and I'm going to use it to help lift others.
Excellent. Well, I'm grateful that you've spent the time joining Mike and I on this podcast today. I'm hopeful and very confident that there are others that are going to take benefit out of this podcast without a doubt and are going to want to go and search you out. We already have one of our clinic managers in your Healthy Business series in terms of one of the programs that you put on through Amy Oliver and Co. If people want to learn more about you, reach out, get to know who this lady is that they may be listening to or viewing on YouTube. Where do they go?
Awesome. So there's 3 good ways to do that. One is check out our website. You can find info on the Healthy Business and a lot of the services and things that we do there. So that's amyoliver.ca. They can email me directly. I love growing my network. So that's an open invitation to send me an email directly to me at amy@amyoliver.ca. And then we're most active on social media on Instagram. And so that's at Amy Oliver Co. And that would be the best ways to contact me. So any of those ways, I'd love to connect with as many people as possible. And yeah, as much as we can support the vet community, I'd love to do that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Mike. Anything in closing from your perspective?
Just thank you. That was great.
Well, Amy, I'm looking forward to future work together, further conversations as our lives cross in multiple ways. For those in the veterinary community, what message do you want to leave for them?
Yeah, it's that, you can practice differently tomorrow than you practiced yesterday. You don't have to fall into the stereotypical norms about what that looks like, and that you are able to live your professional and personal lives in a way that lights you up and means something to you, not only in ways that mean things to the rest of your community. So do that and do it with enthusiasm and vigor, because you only get this one life.
Thank you for listening to the Veterinary Project Podcast. As a recap, on behalf of our hosts, the Veterinary Project Podcast will be releasing new episodes weekly. So be sure to tune in as we bring you more conversations aimed at helping you enjoy a life well lived. If you enjoyed what you heard on the show and you want to stay in the know, please like, love, and or subscribe to the podcast on the listening platform of your choosing, as we're available on all the usual suspects. If you know of others that may benefit from these conversations, we'd love it if you please share the show with them, as this will help us grow our community to reach more and more veterinary professionals. Speaking of which, if you are a veterinary professional and would like to get connected with more like-minded individuals who are joining us on this journey, please send an email to the veterinaryprojectpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll invite you to be a part of our private Facebook group. General feedback, requests for information, or perhaps requests to be a guest on the show can also be sent to the veterinaryprojectpodcast@gmail.com. Dr. Michael Bugg and Dr. Jonathan Light, thank you for listening to the show, and we'll catch you again next week for another episode of the Veterinary Project Podcast. Bye for now.